I see family members who love each other so much, parents who would do anything for their kids, and yet those teens, the partners, those adult kids, those tweens, they can be right there in front of a loving parent and not feel heard or known. And now I'm talking to friends too who have kids who are young adult kids. They can't get their kids to talk and they want to connect with them. I hope you leave this conversation with two things. One is a different perspective about listening, just thinking differently. And number two is some specific, totally doable techniques to experiment when it comes to listening or to hearing. First of all, I'll introduce myself briefly in case you're not familiar with me. I'm Carrie Stutzman. I'm a marriage and family therapist, and I specialize in the experience of being a parent of littles, bigs, teens, tweens, bigger. And so I call myself a parentologist. I live in Denver, Colorado half the time and in an RV half the time. And I've been teaching parenting classes for a long time. So this topic is dear to me. I have three of my own kids and three stepkids. So that's five boys and one girl. So that's just a little bit by way of introduction. Let's dive in by talking just a little bit about what gets in the way of hearing. Why don't we hear each other? Why do people have to go to therapists to be able to be heard? I think there are a handful of things, reasons why we're not very good at hearing our kids, hearing our teens, hearing our partners. One, it's hard to give to someone else something that we haven't been given. So when we don't feel heard, it's really hard to truly hear somebody else. And so many of us didn't grow up with somebody modeling great listening skills because it is a skill. It's an art and a science to really give someone the sense that they're being heard and felt and seen and known. I think number two reason that gets in the way of listening is that we don't really hear what someone is saying because we're listening with our minds running so fast about our own experiences, our judgment of the other, whether or not we agree or disagree, and we're trying to figure out how we're going to respond. So we're not really present to hearing. We're thinking and getting ready to speak. Number three, at least for me, one of the things that what gets in the way of me hearing my kids is fear. So if one of my sons says something like, I don't care if I don't get that application for college filled out, or I don't care if I don't get a good SAT score, whatever, my head would explode with fear about what happens when somebody doesn't really care. I would futurize to where he didn't have education, he didn't have a job, he didn't have love, he didn't have passion or joy or meaning in his life. So I would go way into the future in a ridiculous way, I admit. And then I'd feel like I had to convince him to care. It didn't work very well. So I wasn't really hearing him. I was busy focused on what I wanted to teach him. Number four reason thing that I think gets in the way of really hearing each other is that we're not available. We're busy. And true hearing doesn't really happen when we're multitasking. So if we want our kids to really feel heard by us or our partners to really feel heard by us, it's hard to do it while we're managing all the tasks of home life. I remember when my three kids were little, they would be talking to me. I'd be working in the kitchen. I was just multitasking all over the place. And I remember thinking, I can hear all these sounds and I'm responding, but probably nobody in my family feels like I'm really 100% hearing them. It's part of why I think people like going to therapists because therapists have one single focus. They are listening and hearing, and it feels good to feel so heard. Number five reason thing that I think gets in the way of us being good at hearing is that it's a learned art that not many of us have actually been taught. Think about what we get in education. We take a speech class, we take classes on writing, we give presentations. There's all this focus on how to speak and be heard and write. Speaking is important, and it's one equation in a relationship is speaking well. But the hearing, we don't get trained so much on what are the skills required to actually help somebody feel seen and heard. And number 6 is, I think, conversations in our minds. If we wanna have a big conversation with someone, when we go back later and score it or decide how effective it was, we often score it based on what we got to say. Did we feel heard? But if we put our focus on what we want to say, we disable our loved ones from being able to hear us. If I'm really determined that you are going to hear what I have to say, which I know we moms do that, you're going to hear me. It can make the brain of the listener go into defense mode and they can shut down whether they mean to or not. That gets in the way of us actually listening to somebody in a conversation. Now, there is a caveat there as we talk about really being present and really hearing somebody. There are some relationships, some people who live in relationships that are really corrosive, where their partners can't or won't do any listening and all they do is talking. And that's a different dynamic. So, what I'm really talking about here is in generally healthy relationships, or for parents who want to feel close and connected to their teenagers or their kids of all ages, and they don't know how to get them to talk. And the way we get them to talk is to give them the sense that we are really present and really hearing them. Because the thing I think is so important about hearing is that it's a gift. We can't force people to share their perspective or life experience with us. Teenagers, partners, I've seen it in my own life. I've seen it as the therapist in an office where people are trying to connect, and one person fully has the ability to shut out another one. If someone doesn't want to tell us how they're feeling, what they're upset about, what they're hurt about, how they're feeling, we can't force them. If somebody honors us with sharing their experience, what they're thinking, and what they're feeling, it is a gift. And so it's really important that we learn how to really hear so that they feel welcome and invited and seen and known and cared for when they're sharing with us. In my family, I remember when my kids were little, it just felt like there were words coming in all the time. I was being talked to all the time. And then my boys shifted into teenagers and the table totally turned. And then I had to work to get them to talk to me. I want to know what's going on inside of their world. And I realized that I had to learn the art of hearing them so that they would even trust me to share what was going on inside of them. And maybe some of that's a gender thing because I had a house so full of boys, but I've been a therapist with teenage girls, and their parents are aching and they're nervous because they don't know how their daughters are feeling. They don't know what's going on inside of them. So I don't think it's just a gender equation. Therapy, it's why it's effective because people will pay to feel heard and to learn. So, what I'd like to do as a therapist, as a family therapist, as a couples therapist, is help you go behind the scenes of what therapists do when they are working with a family or with a couple and teach some hearing skills. That's the really good stuff. When I have a couple or parents and a teenager in my office and they're going to share deeper than they would normally because they've been disconnected or cut off from each other, that's the good stuff. So, here are some of the things that I do when I have clients sitting in my office and they want to share and be. The first thing I do is find out what the patterns are. Like, where does communication tend to break down? Because being conscious of the patterns is so helpful. Like, for a lot of mothers and sons or partners or whatever, someone might have a strong feeling and go barreling in and want to talk and just start laying out the anger or not see if it's good timing, and their partner can't do it when they're caught off guard, or sometimes the timing isn't good. If somebody's hungry, like, it just can be really helpful if we want to go into a conversation where we can be heard or where we can get our loved one to talk to us, is to make sure it's at the right time, that they're ready, and that we're in a good headspace to hear them. So in therapy, I get curious and I ask, what are the dynamics? What are the topics that are likely to make you blow up or retreat? And how can you adjust for that? Be conscious of it instead of walking in the door, getting ready to unload on someone. Go, wait, this isn't good timing for either one of us to really hear each other. So I'm going to wait, check, see, is this a good time for us to talk to each other? Another thing that's really important, if you're going to be a listener, if you're going to be listening to your kids or your partner, is to make sure that you're in a good place. Well, what I do in the therapy office is say I have a talker and a listener. I might say to the listener, "Are you in a good place to listen right now to something that might be uncomfortable?" I might have them breathe a little and get grounded in their bodies. I might talk to them about how to tolerate hearing anger and sadness because it's a gift, right? We so often want to avoid hearing our loved one's anger and sadness because we get triggered or we think it's a no go zone. But oh my gosh, if someone's sharing something that's really real to them, that's a gift. And then in this process that I often walk people through, at the end, there's like the yummy stuff, like what they're happy about and grateful for that feels good. If you are wanting to be a better listener and connect better with your people, with your kids, with your partner, the first step is to check in with yourself. Am I in a good place to listen? Can I be present? Can I really hear what my person is saying? And then with the talker, when I'm doing therapist, let's see, this was the listener and this is the talker. I guide them through a few skills for speaking in a way that a listener can hear. And I have them share their intention for sharing because sometimes there's an uncomfortable conversation coming. But if someone goes, okay, I just want you to know the intention for me sharing this, the reason I'm sharing is because I want to be closer. And there's some stuff I haven't told you, or there's some stuff I'm mad about that we haven't been able to talk about. And I'm doing it because I love you and I'm willing to take this risk. That right there can help the listener shift into a calmer state. Now, we don't get that coach at home with our teenagers, with our partners. So the speakers aren't going to be very skilled. I'm just sharing a little bit behind the scenes. When we're in the trenches of home, we have to be prepared that our speakers and our family may not be very skilled when they share stuff, and it can make it harder for us to hear because we can get triggered. One of the things that's really important for listening, for really hearing what's happening inside of your loved person, is to show interest, to show eye contact, to be conscious of your body posture, not turned away, but turned towards. No eye rolling, no big sighs. It's hard sometimes to show up like an adult, whether we're listening to another adult or to our teenage kids. Oh my gosh, my teenage self can rise to the surface and I can be snarky so fast. I hate to admit it. So the more we can like act like a therapist, like nod, look attentive, be caring, look engaged, be listening, and to show up like we are an adult receiving a precious gift from somebody who has the courage or who's bothering to share their inner world with us, whether it's big or whether it's little. You don't want to scare off teens with too much eye contact, but in general, eye contact is a nice thing. And I'm going to share one thing that I used to have to do to be a good hearer with one of my teenagers, because when we would get in the car, that was where we would do some talking. And I would get so triggered sometimes that that's where we would end up yelling and arguing. And so I bought myself a weighted blanket, like a weighted pad. It was about the size of a placemat. And when I would pick that kid up in the car, I would have it on my lap as my reminder, like, Carrie, stay calm, stay in your body. Don't go like way up here and get reactive. If he talks to you, you want to stay calm and not be reactive, not go into that fear cycle. So for me, really showing up as a good listener, I do this before sessions. And if I really want to hear someone, is just to be conscious of being in my body and slowing down my head so that I can really listen to somebody. And then We listen from a place of honoring the talker as a valued person who's having their own experience, their own views. We listen from a place of not thinking about how we're going to respond. We listen from a place of curiosity, just what is it like to be this person and be experiencing this dynamic that they're talking about? Just curiosity, not jumping into our own views, not thinking about our response, but listening what it's like to understand. That is our only job. If we want our loved people to talk to us and we want them to feel heard and cared for by us, I think we really have to listen from that perspective of just honoring them, not spinning with a response or a teaching or a lesson, but just be present and just hear and to respond with some empathy. Like we're hearing a story that we're not going to try to fix, but we're just feeling love for the person telling us the story of what's going on. Later, maybe there can be discussion, there can be problem solving if the talker wants problem solving and talking. But right now, it's just about hearing. Because for so many of us, raise your hand if you know someone who when they if they have something hard going on, they're not looking for someone to solve their problems. They just want someone to hear them. I remember times of just being really sad and nobody could fix the problems I was dealing with. But when I could just share with a good girlfriend who was good at listening and I felt heard, I felt better. Problem wasn't solved, but I felt. Feel free for those of you who are live if you have any questions to jump in and ask those. There are what else do I want to say? Oh, yeah, one of the things that I was thinking about is how as oh, maybe I mentioned it, how our little kids, they talk to us all the time and then they stop talking. And so one of the things that I had to do with one of my teenagers who really started stopping talking to me was I started to realize that just because I, as the mom, was in the mood to talk to him and I would ask him all kinds of questions like, how are you going? How's school? What's going on with friends, girls, this, that, and the other? I would pummel him with too many questions. And he would just leave or he would just go mute. And so I really had to learn to wait for the right timing. And so I would jot myself a little list that I had on my phone so that if he came and I could tell that it was an open moment on his part, then maybe I might calmly ask a couple of questions and just listen without going into mom mode, without going into lecturing or teaching or giving advice mode, but just hearing him. And sometimes I had to wait a week or two until I found that particular 16-year-old at that particular stage willing to talk. But he had his open times. And if I could just not pummel him with questions and not jump in and try to force him to talk, which was a fool's errand, then is when I got to have some of those open conversations. I've also had to work really hard to learn to stop reacting and stop trying to boss my kids around. I spent so long doing that, teaching them everything. And now, if I want them to feel heard, I just have to honor them as their own people. And one last thing that I want to share a little bit about is that I did this research project with a group of teenage and college age young women. And we had it was called Bridge the Gap Between Parents and Teens. And it was about how to keep communication open between parents and teens. And it was so interesting how even these teenage girls who were like high achieving, great kids, they came from good families and still they didn't feel heard. And like they felt parented, but they didn't feel necessarily heard. And I remember them saying things like, I wish my parents were just curious about who I am as a person and not as a project of theirs. And they longed to have their parents like ask them out for dinner. And they wanted to be able to say no if it was at a bad time. But they would say things like, I don't really let my parents know this, but I want them to want to have conversations with me. And when they ask, I might say no, but wanted to hear, they still wanted us to want to know what was going on with them. And in couples therapy, when I see couples who aren't connected, I see two people sitting in my room who long to feel heard and understood. A phrase I like is, or how, what I would challenge or encourage you to do is to listen for real, like really listen and just hear, turn off the brain and hear. And then also to be brave and ask. And I love the question, what do you wish I knew? Scary to ask. But if we can get ourselves in a good state and just say, what do you wish I knew? And give them time to answer and listen with eye contact, with caring, with kindness, with empathy. And when they're done, rather than defend ourselves, just say something like, thank you so much for sharing that with me. Thank you for trusting me enough to share that. It can go a long way. This topic of hearing, I think, could be a whole series. I have a whole talk, or not a talk, these are just conversations, just casual live talks about bridging the gap between parents and teens. I have a whole list of approaches there. Therapy 101, the first thing they teach future therapists is how to listen. I'd love to share some of those skills. I don't want to go into too long of a conversation right now. Another one is this really great exercise called the flow of feelings or emotional house cleaning that can be great for two people just to do a check in, not about how you're thinking or what you're doing, but just a simple, easy way to do an emotional house cleaning. Like, how are you feeling? So, I might have a future live coming about. Another one is how to talk so the other can hear us without shutting down. If we want other people to hear us, we have to learn how to speak with skill so that we don't automatically shut their brains down, put them on defensive mode, make them feel attacked, throw little darts, start at the wrong time. There's so many things that we can do inadvertently and unconsciously that can keep the person we want to talk to from being able to hear us. And then there is also a whole conversation about the science of listening. What I'm talking about right now is the art of listening. There's also a science of listening about mirror neurons, co-regulation, energetic stance that we come from. So before we sign off, I'd love if you want to chat any of your takeaways and or if there's anything that you're committed to just based on hearing this. And mine is I set myself this challenge on Friday night and I didn't actually do very well with it. So I'm going to try it again tonight. Is when my family members talk to me, so it's my husband, my son, and my stepdaughter who are here right now, I want to practice actually hearing. I get paid to listen for my job as a therapist, but it doesn't mean at home when there's all that stuff going on that I'm always very good at it. So I am going to get myself a sticky note. Look, I've written it down already to just remember while we're cooking dinner, while we're eating, to just listen in a way that I can actually hear and be grateful for the gift of somebody sharing with me. Thanks so much for joining. Thanks so much for watching.